Welcome to the second Iconics webinar. Today we will be going a little bit more in depth, looking at the achievements of the scenarios framework over the past few years and the needs that came out of the discussions that we had at the last scenarios forum and how we should move forward with the scenarios framework. And we do so on the basis of the paper that was published last year, and which you should see now here on my screen, the paper on achievements and needs of the scenarios framework that was led by Brian O'Neill and had many co-authors that led sessions and were part of the steering committee of the scenarios forum in 2019. Now, it's good before we go into this to actually take a step back and look at what the goals of the scenarios framework were when it was developed, so that when we think about needs and further work, that we keep these goals in mind. And so the primary goal of the scenarios framework is to support climate change related research across a wide range of research communities, different disciplines, and to be extendable to other scales and sectors and issue areas. And we'll see that there's some mixed success, I think, on this goal, but this is a very important primary goal to keep in mind, that it's really across research communities and to be across scales. Second goal is to facilitate the research that integrates climate and societal futures, and do so by providing more detailed socioeconomic and political conditions as input to studies of impacts, adaptation, and of mitigation. To foster the consideration of uncertainty by providing a wide range of plausible futures, and to encourage more coherent assessment of scientific assessments by improving the consistency of climate societal assumptions in the literature, right? Because we want it's the shared part of shared socioeconomic pathways, where if they are shared across many different studies, then it will be easier to map the different scenarios that are used in different studies to each other and have consistent scenarios, consistent assessment. And then final goal is to support the research and then to inform policy. So this should really trickle through to inform policy making, and we are also reaching that stage, of course. Now, the ingredients of the SSPRCP scenario framework, we already went into this, of course, last time during the tutorial, but just a brief recap here. There's a lot of material from last month that you can look into, but we have on the top of this figure, we have the three main ingredients of the SSPRCP framework, namely the RCPs, the representative concentration pathways, the temperature targets, basically, or the concentration pathways. And on the right, we have the societal pathways, how society develops over time. Both of these feed into their own modeling communities that take them up. So the SSPs have been taken up by the integrated assessment modeling community, and they have developed scenarios of emissions, land use, and concentrations. At the same time, the RCPs were picked up by the climate model community, and the results of both scenarios can be brought together basically now or since a few years into the integrated scenarios and analyses, and we are seeing those emerging in the literature. And then there are the policy assumptions, the shared policy assumptions, which go on the one hand into the IAM scenarios, because mitigation and collaboration during mitigation is an important aspect of the IAM scenarios, but they are also playing a role in integrated analyses that are now emerging. Yeah, this figure we've also seen a lot actually in the last tutorial, but I wanted to get back to it to show that if we look at the achievements of the scenarios framework, for one, there are many papers using it, but two, about half of the papers at the moment are in this dark blue area looking in climate impacts and adaptation. And then about a third or so on the right, the light blue block on the right is looking into mitigation studies of energy, land use, and emissions. And then there are subtopics across other communities. But a large share of the application at the moment of the SSPs is really on the impacts side. And then if we look at how these are applied at the moment in the literature, if we look at the application of SSPs and versus RCPs in the literature, and what is striking here is, well, for one, there's a clear preference in literature to use SSP2. If you look at at this figure, where darker colors mean higher use, lighter colors mean lighter use in the literature. So you can see this outside of the matrix. You can see this by SSP and by RCP level. And so there is a clear preference for SSP2, RCP 4.5, and RCP 8.5 across the literature as standing out as most used. And the other thing that is striking is that some of the combinations that are deemed unlikely are still used quite a bit in the literature. This holds especially on the RCP 8.5 level, where SSP5 is formally the only integrated assessment model implementation that can make it all the way up to RCP 8.5. But it also holds on the lower level, where we still see applications also in the literature of SSP3 combined with the very low mitigations scenarios of RCP 1.9 and 2.6. And this is in principle, there are two reasons why this either could be problematic or could not be problematic. And one of the dimensions where one should look at is time. I think the further out one goes into the future, the wider the range across the different SSPs get, and the more this issue of inconsistency actually starts to play a role. If one looks out 1 or 2 or 3 decades, it is not as big of an issue as if one looks at the end of the century. And the other aspect on why this might or might not be an issue is the more information is used from the IEM implementation, the more this inconsistency actually matters. If one only uses population, the question basically is whether at that level of population from that given SSP, it is unlikely to still have an RCP 8.5 emission scenario. If one uses population and GDP, it becomes the question whether that combination of population and GDP leads to unlikely with very high emissions. And the more you bring in also from the integrated assessment when it comes to energy, when it goes to land use and other aspects of the SSPs, the bigger of an issue it becomes that these combinations were deemed unlikely. Good. That was sort of about the state of the scenarios framework. Now we move into the 7 recommendations that came out of the paper, and that were, or that more or less came out in the synthesis of the scenarios forum 2 years ago, and that we have shaped into this paper. So here, one recommendation is to improve the integration of societal and climate conditions. And there are several aspects to this. One is to really improve the understanding of future resilience, to better characterize future resilience of societies. And so this means going beyond monetary poverty, for which we have seen many high quality projections consistent with the SSPs, but move towards multidimensional poverty to really be better able to describe the resilience of a society, and also describe broader aspects of society, such as societal protection networks, social protection networks, and how strong those are. And a second part of this is to improve the consideration of extreme events. An option here is to combine the RCP framework with physical climate storylines to describe basically future worlds, both from the societal perspective and from the climate perspective, and to describe how a certain future society could be dealing with certain future extreme events and how those could impact that society, and be much more explicit about that than we are at the moment in our analyses. Matching the scales in climate and societal information is relevant here in this integration of societal and climate conditions. One example here is, for instance, the use of land use and how land use changes in the SSPs that has implications for regional climate in climate models. And this is not necessarily consistent. There's been recent publications on how consistent or inconsistent this is. But this is definitely also something that we should improve our communication on. And then, as basically just discussed with the last slide already, is the plausibility of certain SSP-RCP combinations that we should have a more careful look and be careful when we apply different corners of the matrix on how plausible those corners are. And we might want to actually develop indicators for how consistent certain aspects are within the framework. The second big recommendation coming out of the Scenarios Forum is to improve the applicability to regional and local scales. And here we've seen applications of the SSPs across many different scales, from cities to countries to world regions, continents, and the globe. But the big issue struggling with here is to maintain consistency across all of these skills and the richness of approaches, because there is at the moment basically no widely agreed method on how to go from the global SSPs towards the national level, or the other way around. We see projects where bottom-up scenarios that are developed in a very participatory way are being mapped onto the SSPs, but also here is no necessary consistency of how this is done. And this makes, of course, assessment later on more complicated if certain papers would need to come with a bit of a footnote or a warning and say, hey, the mapping in this paper is not really the same as is broadly understood within the framework and how the framework is applied. And therefore we need to develop credible, reproducible, consistent methods for how to use the SSPs across different scales. So one thing that would help here is a more diverse set of global SSPs, global narratives, where stakeholders and participants in meetings could recognize themselves somewhat easier than in the current SSPs sometimes. We need to grow towards a community consensus around what methods to use for using the SSPs across scales. And we have seen in some regions very successful applications of sanctioned or more harmonized regional scenarios that are developed with some level of authority, like the US National Climate Assessment, but in other regions we see similar SSP consistent scenarios emerging. The third recommendation is to improve the relevance beyond the climate research community, because the SSPs were originally clearly developed for climate and with climate in mind, but also had the aim to be used beyond that. And what we've seen in the past years is that, for instance, IPBES, the biodiversity assessment, and the World in 2050, which focuses on sustainable development pathways to reach all of the sustainable development goals at once, have both identified limitations in using the SSP-RCP framework and developed alternative other approaches, which is in principle not a problem. But since the intention of the SSP RCP framework was also to be applicable in a wider context, we should try to move beyond that and actually enable that. So the concrete recommendations here is to bring the to map the SSPs or SSP indicators to key drivers of sustainability, to bridge that gap closer, to extend the narratives, to also better inform analyses around sustainable development goals and biodiversity, for example, but also maybe other aspects are a little missing in the current narratives that could be enriched. If we have parallel activities going on, like IPBES, it would be very useful if there would be a mapping of how the scenarios in these different large-scale projects actually relate to each other, and how one can map one scenario onto the other, or whether there is a translation of one scenario archetype to another in a different framework, and that we have that basically real time as the activities go on, rather than have it after the fact and a few years later. And then finally, it would be really helpful to expand the guidance material online repositories to collect the information here. And in this context, actually worth mentioning that CSIN started an effort to collect databases related to the SSP quantifications beyond the core indicator database that's hosted by IASA. Then this recommendation, the fourth recommendation, I'm going to skip over because we have a video from Tim Carter to speak about this. Then moving on to the fifth one, that is on capturing relevant perspectives and uncertainties. That clearly came out also during the scenarios forum discussions, both in plenary and in some sessions, that while the SSPs on the one hand capture a very wide range of future uncertainties and perspectives on how the future might evolve, relevant for climate, there are also other scenario perspectives lacking. There is, for example, a lack of scenarios with very limited growth in high income countries, or scenarios with a focus on eco-communalism are not part of the current set of scenarios. And another example is futures that are driven or disturbed by certain really disruptive events. The example is, of course, COVID, how COVID could change society for decades to come in a certain direction. But one could also think of certain climate events or certain societal events, other societal events that could really put a stamp on how society develops. Another one is the need for constant reevaluation in this context. Especially if we look at the RCP framework, the upper and the lower range both are being debated a lot, and both are actually in need also of constant reevaluation, whether they are still relevant and up to date, and whether they need to be actually narrowed down or widened. And also, in order to actually to have those more broader perspectives at the table, it's very important to make the scenario development process as inclusive as we can. Spread the use of scenarios with people providing feedback on using them, and this is essential part of also what we try to do actually with the webinar series here. But it is not it proves not to be easy to get many people from many different disciplines and geographic backgrounds all around the table in the community environment that we have around developing the SSPs. Then there is one specific recommendation on how to keep the scenarios up to date, because keeping that the SSPs need to be kept up to date, of course, is incredibly clear, but there is this inherent tension between constant revisions, or between revising the scenarios, and at the same time providing a very stable set of scenario information that can be consistently used across the scientific literature for a period of 5 or 10 or 15 years, and should be comparable for a long time. And if there's constant updates, this becomes less easy to do. And so one needs to think of a versioning system, for instance, of different SSP drivers or SSPs, and to develop a process to update the SSP narratives and the quantifications that balances between stability and being up to date. And so the very concrete recommendation that came out of this is to have relatively regular updates for the quantitative drivers and the IM scenarios about every 5 years, maybe the quantitative drivers, population and GDP, even more often. Population scenarios have been updated every 2 to 3 years so far. However, we started the discussion on doing this about a year ago, and then COVID hit, and making future projections became a bit of an extra uncertain game. And so this has been, we are restarting the effort to do this at the moment. At the same time, narratives and the framework itself should be more stable, but since the narratives have been around now for 5 to 10 years, also there we should start thinking towards a next scenarios forum to have there the discussion on whether we miss narratives and whether we should update the framework in that and enrich the framework with more narratives. And then RCP updates for the emission scenarios across the different different levels of forcing into the future. These basically update at the speed of a natural update speed around the different CMIP rounds and around the IPCC reports. And this can sometimes lead to small scale inconsistency, but with clear versioning, we thought that we could actually may be able to overcome a lot of the confusion here. Good, then the last recommendation before we also move on to Tim's video about recommendation number 4 is to improve the relevance of climate change scenarios for users beyond the traditional policymaking community. And we have seen that scenarios are used by many new people new to using scenarios in general, but also using the climate scenarios in general specifically. So for instance, in the business and financial sector, we see a lot of growth of use of climate scenarios. Also there, people start to realize that you need really that the impacts of climate and climate risk is really dependent on how society develops into the future. So there is a demand for using the SSPs in that context. Similarly, with local governments and civil society, those are untraditional users of these scenarios that actually have a very high need for information. And so this highlights a need for something that we labeled climate change scenario services to help people understand the SSP RCP framework, to improve the communication of the scenario results and make it, build tailored portals that make it easier to access the scenario products and have more stakeholder involvement also so that we get more feedback from users, and that there is more ownership with society and recognition within society of these scenarios and what's behind them. Yeah, briefly, this is an excerpt from a very big table in the paper itself, and that you might want to explore the bigger table rather than my short summary here. But what we try to do is to say we have these 7 recommendations as we have them here on top in the different columns of this table. And within each of the recommendations and across all of these 7 that we just discussed, there is a long list basically of small steps that can all be taken. And we have before clustered all these small steps within just a single one of these big 7 recommendations. However, every small step helps probably with some of the other big recommendations as well. And so, for example, in the first recommendation on improving climate and societal integration, the first recommendation there was to extend the SSPs to include more indicators than just monetary poverty, but have broader descriptions of vulnerability and resilience. Now, this clearly, of course, helps with climate and societal integration, but it also helps with the connection to certain regions and connecting to policy discussions in those regions. And it helps in improving the relevance of the SSP framework beyond just climate alone. It also helps with bridging this towards sustainable development indicators and sustainable development pathways. And similarly, any of these small recommendations actually are of relevance to across multiple of these 7 columns that you see here. And the ones that are, of course, that are more relevant, have more benefits, sort of clearly indicate that that there's a big use in making them in making progress on them. Right? Like for instance, here in improving the scenario development process itself, the one with the 5 tick boxes across 5 of the columns is to make the scenario development process more as inclusive as possible, because that helps with regional focus and regional applicability. It helps to improve the relevance beyond climate, to connect better to policy, to capture more diverse perspectives, and to connect better to users. And so recommendations like this that cover many boxes are definitely the ones I think as a community we should try to prioritize. Similarly here, there is the big table in the paper. I don't want to spend too much time here on going over these tables. I basically repeat the recommendations that I just explained for each of the 7 bigger topics. But as you see, again here, what is very beneficial or very broadly beneficial is to develop guidance material and online repositories so that we can have more interdisciplinary collaboration and capacity building. And then skip over this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see whether Anik dares to play the the video that we received from Tim Carter on recommendation number 4, whether we're going to invite Tim to give his presentation live.
The 4th recommendation in the scenarios framework paper is to produce a broader range of reference scenarios that may include impacts and/or policy. This section was drafted by myself, Tim Carter from the Finnish Environment Institute Syke in Finland, Elmar Kriegler from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impacts Research, PIC, in Germany, and Brian O'Neill from the Joint Climate Change Research Institute in the US. We've already heard that SSPs are reference pathways describing societal trends that make it easier or harder to mitigate or adapt to climate change. This is shown as challenges to mitigation and to adaptation on the axes of the graph on the right-hand side of the screen. SSPs are designed to represent uncertainties in socioeconomic factors that affect, on the one hand, greenhouse gas concentrations that are responsible for the anthropogenic forcing of the climate system, and on the other hand, exposure and vulnerability of societies to impacts of those climate changes. However, it's important to remember that these SSPs assume no climate policy and no impacts of climate change. They are, in a sense, counterfactuals or baseline scenarios against which we can compare the effectiveness of policies of mitigation and adaptation. However, this is only one possible way of constructing a counterfactual, and alternative reference scenarios could also be envisaged. So here we'll illustrate this by offering 3 examples of other alternative new reference scenarios that might be considered in future. And all 3 of these are mentioned in the article. One includes mitigation policy, the second includes climate impacts for adaptation policy, and the third includes assumptions of relevance for sustainability policy. In this respect, if one were to construct a figure with the new reference scenarios, the dimensions might change from that of the SSPs, for example, showing different axes such as challenges to new climate policy or challenges to sustainability. In this first example, let us consider a graph that shows time from the present out to the end of the century on the x-axis, and some measure of greenhouse gas reduction on the y-axis. So here there may be some global mitigation target for greenhouse gas concentration, for example, related to the Paris Agreement, which might be the goal of our policy analysis for some point in the future. In other words, where we want to be. Using a conventional SSP reference pathway, we could represent future global developments without climate policy intervention, with greenhouse gas concentrations determined by all those societal developments and other policies that might influence them. That is the conventional counterfactual. So what kind of policies might be needed to approach the greenhouse gas target? There's provision for considering this in the scenarios framework, outlined in the article by means of so-called shared climate policy assumptions, or SPAs. One application of SPAs, used for example in the recent IPCC report on the 1.5 degrees warming relates to ongoing policies. There's been recent interest in studying the effectiveness of mitigation policies that have already been committed by countries around the world, the so-called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, by appending these to the SSPs. These produce an SPA of what has been promised under the Paris Agreement and what this might mean for greenhouse gas concentrations. So that's the brown line. However, while the NDCs can make progress towards the greenhouse gas targets, they're currently inadequate to get close to them. To achieve this requires consideration of other, more stringent mitigation scenarios. That's the red. However, the conventional SSP reference scenarios are increasingly looked at as being unrealistic because we know that mitigation policy is already occurring. In a sense, then, the SPAs that account for ongoing policy, the brown on the previous figure, might be regarded by some analysts as more representative as a counterfactual or baseline to use for analysing policies than would be required to take us beyond what can be achieved by policies already committed in the NDCs. These new reference scenarios would hence depart from the non-intervention SSPs, as they would include mitigation policies that have already been committed. Our second example focuses on impacts and adaptation. A clear imperative of international policy is improvements in human security with respect to food, clean water, other natural resources and employment, so as to avoid potential conflicts and associated impacts such as migration. Aspirations for human security are embedded in such targets as the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Resource scarcity and conflicts have occurred throughout history and would be anticipated even in the absence of climate change. A counterfactual scenario such as an SSP might therefore describe situations where we might otherwise have been heading if there were no climate change occurring, no climate impacts and no climate policy. The only trends occurring would be societal developments that might influence human security, such as poverty, pollution or inequality. A policy scenario might then focus on putting in place measures for alleviating poverty, for developing agriculture, for conflict resolution, or for establishing emergency safety nets. However, as in the mitigation case, such a reference scenario doesn't really reflect realistic conditions of what we would actually expect in the future. Indeed, a conventional impact analysis would usually focus on estimating how future climate change would impact food or water security under different assumed levels of socioeconomic development expressed by SSPs and mitigation expressed by RCP-based climate projections. With respect to a target of improved human security, the impact scenario might actually provide a more useful new reference, where the policy scenario would then address many of the same issues as was the case without climate change, but here within the context of adapting to climate change, which might itself have exacerbated issues such as food and water security, inequality and poverty, hence offering a more realistic reference for new policies. As such, with the climate policy focus, this time for adaptation policy, this could also be described as a shared policy assumption. The third example departs from the previous two cases in that it widens the focus beyond climate policy alone to the broader scope of sustainability. Given that most climate policy is inextricably linked to broader environmental and economic policies, it's long been understood that there can be advantages of treating climate as part of a wider set of policy needs. The set of SSPs developed for climate change analysis could potentially be applied as reference scenarios for studying wider issues, such as biodiversity and sustainable development. Here we consider targets of sustainable development for which the SDGs are useful near-term examples. Conventional SSPs could provide a reference for evaluating progress towards sustainable development goals brought about by key socioeconomic drivers in the absence of climate change, or climate impacts, or climate policy. In other words, where we might otherwise be heading in the absence of those. Then policy scenarios might use these reference scenarios as a point of departure for considering policies for attaining sustainable development targets, such as through poverty alleviation, nature-based solutions, or pollution reduction, for example. However, given the crucial importance of climate change and its impacts and policy implications for the achievement of Sustainable Development Objectives, it might perhaps be more realistic to assess where we could be heading through a set of integrated scenarios, including SSPs, the nationally determined contributions, the RCPs, and climate impacts. Then, by using this as a policy reference in the context of sustainable development, there will be an opportunity to consider climate policy measures alongside and in concert with sustainable development policy measures for achieving sustainability targets. So to summarise, new reference scenarios based on, but as a development of, the SSP framework could firstly offer more realism as baseline counterfactuals than SSPs. Second, could reflect recent developments in climate policy not captured in the SSPs. Third, they could broaden the applicability of policy scenarios beyond climate, hence contributing to efforts towards greater coherence in policies for environment and development. As a final note of caution, though, with different types of reference scenarios being used in different contexts to address different policy questions, it would be essential to provide clear labelling of new reference scenarios so that they can be distinguished from each other and from the original SSPs, for example, to avoid possible double counting of policies or of impacts.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that contribution from Tim. So before we open up for discussion, I wanted to have a few words about what we are planning for the next few months, because based on these 7 recommendations and the plan to organize a next scenarios forum at the late spring of 2022, so around June 2022 probably. We want to get the discussion started on some of these recommendations, and at the moment, basically prioritized or are planning to go have an in-depth webinar on each of these 7 recommendations, and these can be very different in format. Some might go into recent developments that we have seen. Some might go into potential solutions or proposals where we can discuss directions, and others can be panel discussions on the topic. In order to actually help us to prioritize a bit what issues to focus on and what you as a user community and developer community around these scenarios find most important issues to discuss, we've developed this this poll and match link that Anik has just posted in the chat, where you can rank the 7 recommendations basically from most important to least important to you, or in terms of priority. I mean, it's not an objective ranking. It's not a waterproof way of polling what the people think, but it's just a tool to help us in seeing what are the topics that you guys are most interested in to hear about and to discuss, so that we can prioritize the development of webinars around these topics rather than send you off with a series of topics that you are not interested in at all. So one thing that came out of the discussions here internally on the organization is that the most likely first topic for next month would be to focus on the integration of societal and climate futures, where there has been very interesting work recently by in the US, and where we can have this discussion on how to do that. But on all of the other topics, yeah, we are working on developing webinars there to discuss with you. We now basically have about 12 minutes left for Q&A. We have a few authors of the paper here in our on the webinar. We have, as far as I've seen, we have Brian O'Neill, the main author of the paper, being here. We have Chris Ebai, who contributed to several of the sections here and co-chair of Iconics. Tim Carter, who just presented to you about the alternative baseline alternative reference pathways. And Eric and Benedict is here as well, and he wrote the section on additional perspectives or missing perspectives from the scenario framework. And so these are definitely topics on which we have expertise related to the paper here on the call. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand so that we can so that you can actually ask them. Claudia, yes.
Okay, given that nobody else asks question, I thought I hijacked the conversation towards this very last topic that is the one that interests me the most, which is this idea of including climate impacts on scenarios. And it's almost like a head spinning proposition because of all the uncertainties in representing climate impacts. And so I'm wondering if people are trying to think of ways to systematize the adoption of the representation of climate impacts across IAM IAMs. And the way I'm thinking about this, that, you know, I think it would be necessary somehow to give some rule or some guidance on how to represent climate impacts and how to use, you know, the ensemble mean of a CMIP emulator, for example, or lookup table for impacts that have been registered to global warming levels or something, and not leave every IAM to represent climate impacts as they see fit, because then I feel like comparison across SSPs with climate impacts would become really difficult. So I was wondering if people have reactions to that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm not sure if one of the other authors on the call on the online would want to take it. Please raise your hand or let that know. See, I have a lot of takers here. Let's first have Brian, then Eric.
I mean, yeah, just a quick reaction on this. I think it is. I think this is a really important evolution of the framework that needs to take place on these alternative new reference scenarios, and certainly adding impacts to reference scenarios is going to be complicated, right? Because there's wide uncertainty in them, and you don't want to shut down the research on, you know, what are the agricultural impacts in a given scenario. On the other hand, sort of the demand for having some common set that can serve a subset of purposes is really important. So I think we just have to try some experimentation and see what the issues are. So if they are, you know, as you say, Claudia, organizing a default assumption on the climate side that might be a mean is one thing. We have these large projects. We have AgMIP, we have EasyMIP. We may want to draw on those for some sort of semi-consensus default set of impacts, while trying at the same time to communicate that the impact community should, of course, continue to look at a wide range of potential impacts, that this doesn't solve the impact problem. It just provides a kind of default assumption that may be useful if your work requires agricultural impacts, but that's not really your main focus. So just one thought to start, though.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. One thought on top of that crossed my mind is that this sounds almost like the need for something like a handshake document, which was developed 10 years ago in handing off the IAM scenarios towards the climate modeling community, and this is almost something you would want to develop to do the other way around, as a handshake guidance, basically. Could be an interesting direction to pursue. Any other questions? people want to bring up. Otherwise, I'm gonna look in the meantime what you guys all filled out in terms of prioritization. And okay, so it looks like we made a very good guess with our first topic for next month, because integration of societal climate conditions really comes out clearly on top of what everybody ranks the most relevant relevant topic to look into. Yeah, if there's no further questions on from people, Tim, is that a physically raised hand?
I just wanted to follow up on the impacts question, because I think it's not only within the integrated assessment modeling world at global scale that one might be interested in looking at impacts, and it's something I didn't mention in the presentation, but one could actually study one type of impact with respect to other types of impact as your sort of reference. So I talked about conflict, but I was talking about conflict in a more general sense. But actually, conflict is quite a difficult issue in its own right. It's a rather controversial subject for the impacts community to wrestle with. But one could envisage thinking about impacts of climate change on conflict as they occur via other impacts, such as on food security and water security. So you do your impact assessment on water security and food security. You wouldn't do a sort of impact assessment directly on conflict, even if you could do that, but you'd be using your water and food as a sort of baseline impact condition to then study what the implications might be for conflict. I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear there, because it's rather similar to the example I gave anyway, but that was more looking at policies you might need, and this could just be looking at the pure impacts that would occur out of that. And so I think by holding sort of certain impacts as sort of baseline levels and studying other impacts, you might actually get some sense of the interactions between the impacts. So that might be an interesting thing to do, and you can do that at any scale. It doesn't have to be global.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very valuable addition as well. Yeah, then yeah, I want to leave it at the announcement, basically, that we will go in depth with in-depth sessions over all 7 of these points. Each of them is really interesting enough to fill more than 1 hour with. And so we will have a nice few months ahead of us with very interesting discussions on how to further develop the scenario framework and how different lines of research can come together here. In the meantime, we will, as already mentioned in the chat, we will post the recording of this webinar on YouTube and on the Iconics website. So if you, so please spread the word, so that also next time that more people can watch the recording, people can go back to the information that we have here, and then with that, want to leave it for today, and hope to see many of you next month.